First, thanks everyone for coming out, and thanks to the sponsors to help make this event. And thanks for the patience for all the technical difficulties. So, clicked it, figured it out, we're recording. So today we're going to talk about Discover Dropfort Build. Dropfort Build is essentially a development tool. It's more than just a development environment. It provides other things like your continuous integration. It's basically a project that scaffolds files into your current project. So we'll talk about the different solutions, the problems we're trying to solve, pros and cons of it, and then at the end we'll talk about a little demo and show how you can use these different services, turn them on, turn them off, and kind of explore and go around. So, who am I? I'm Steven Stapleton, been working at Coldfront Labs for 2 years. I'm a web developer, so do some site building, do some web development, and we use Dropfort Build for a lot of our websites. So who's this presentation for? Drupal developers, project managers, tech enthusiasts. So if you're a Drupal developer, you can use this project to quickly get a website up and running. You can have multiple websites open and running at the same time. For us, for example, we're a Drupal shop, so when we do site updates on a Thursday, I can have like 4 sites open at the same time and doing all the site updates as well. Project managers can evaluate if this is a good tool to use for their current work. Tech enthusiasts would be helpful for a tech enthusiast because you can go into the code, you can see the containers, the dev containers, the CI, and kind of see how things are done. And it's a great way to learn more about Drupal. So, story time. When I first started working at Coldfront Labs, one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to build my own Drupal site from scratch. And I didn't know about web servers and databases and Apache and all that stuff. It was brand new to me. So the first thing I did was go to their website, and then I go and I download it, and then it's like, okay, now I have their source code on my computer, but how do I actually run it? How do I host it? How do I use it? So you need a database, you need a web server, you got to install Apache, you got to configure it, and then you got to go into your database and do all that stuff. And that is a big learning curve, and I think one of the things that is kind of a push right now for Drupal is making it easier to get on board. And with Drupal, for example, with like Drupal 10.3, they make UI changes to make the experience easier to use. So that leads to our next slide. Websites shouldn't make you cry. And if you recognize the person at the bottom, gave the presentation in the morning, he's my manager, and he's actually the one who made that quote. I really like that quote. We haven't hung it up at the office yet, but the idea is that when you want to get started with making a website, it'd be really nice if we can just get started and play around with it and learn without having to overcome all these technical hurdles just to get a simple Hello World site. So one, let's identify the problem. What are we trying to solve? So we want consistency, we want streamline development, and we want reliability. So consistency, simplifying team collaboration, avoiding relearning. So if we have multiple sites, for example, and we're using different toolings, then we would have to learn the same tooling every time or set it up every time. And improve maintenance. If we fix an issue on one site, well, we would like that fix to be on all the sites, so we can all share from that. So consistency reduces confusion in the learning curve. Streamlining development, so having our release workflow. So for example, if you have your development environment or your production environment, sometimes you might want to just push your changes on there. Sometimes you want to manage the releases. Integrated development environment, so having your actual development environment be integrated with like VS Code or whatever your favorite one is to use, and having it just plug and play, like you just boot it up and then it works. So that way we can get into Drupal and start exploring and playing around with it. And then reliability. So admittedly, a lot of us like to manually test changes, and we don't always test the changes all the time, especially if it's a little change. So by having automated testing, every single time you push a change out, we can confirm and check that it actually works. And having a uniform code base, the more you share your code and the more it's used, the more you can find bugs and fix those issues. And lastly, enforcing Drupal best practices. So, for example, if you want to write some code and you go to push that code, can we check every single time, okay, did we follow Drupal's best practices? Which is important because when you're following a consistent coding style, or best practices in this case, then it's essentially communication, because then when you see something specific, then you can say, oh, like this is a class, or not even that specifically, but like you can identify different areas of the code based on if it's following best practices and doing things consistently. So what are the different solutions available for us for when we want to create a development environment? So I'm sure a lot of you probably heard of XAMPP, maybe you've used it before. It's a free open source tool, gives you Apache, MariaDB, PHP, everything you need in order to get started with the Drupal site. So the pros and cons of this, it's easy to use, all in one package, user-friendly GUI, and some of the cons of it is environment consistency. So, for example, if you install XAMPP on your computer and then you go and you configure it, it may not be, and likely won't be, the same environment as, for example, someone else who's running the same code as you, but is also running XAMPP and has it configured. It can be complex to make configuration changes. You need to go into the config file and actually type in your changes, and the lack of isolation because it's not in the container. So DDEV, it's essentially a Docker-based PHP development environment, very popular, open source. Highly recommend using this tool. We aren't using DDEV or Dropfort Build only because of it just didn't meet our specific needs at the time. We may use DDEV in the future, but this is kind of the go-to one for your development environment. So pros and cons of DDEV. It's very popular, lots of community support, lots of documentation. There's specific templates for your Drupal site. It's using Docker container, so has environment isolation. And some cons of it, it may be difficult to customize if you want to manage everything that you're doing. Difficult to automate certain tasks. Containers, you're going to be resource intensive because you're using Docker. And then you get the Dropfort Build. So, as we talked about Dropfort Build, it's essentially a composer package that you require into your project, which then scaffolds files. So some of the things that scaffolds into your project is CI/CD files. So for example, if you're using GitLab, you can have automated testing, you can have visual testing to see the differences between your websites, and you can do services as well. So for example, Apache Solr, or Selenium Grid if you want to do browser testing. So some of the pros and cons of it, enhanced debugging tools. So you don't have to do print statements. You can actually use something like Xdebug or TwigDebug to go in and debug your code and understand what's going on. Supports continuous deployments out of the box. So as we talked about, scaffolds GitLab CI files. So that way you can just push your code and then you can go and have your deployments, as we talked about earlier, and integrated testing tools. So one of the parts of it is your package.json file, which has several npm scripts that you can run in your local container and that are also being used in your CI pipeline. Some of the cons can be resource intensive because it's using Docker. Limited support for older systems since they may not be used as much, and manual deletion and comparison of scaffolded files. So essentially, with the scaffolding, certain files aren't going to be overwritten manually, aren't going to be written automatically. So you'll have to actually go and look at the changes between them and then update it for what you want. So let's talk about Dropfort Build more, talk about some of the essentials. So how does this solve our problem of consistency, streamline development, reliability. So we have the Dropfort Build workflow. So as we talked about, we have releases. There are two types of releases. You have automated deployments, and then you have tagged releases. So we use a standard commit package, which essentially checks your commits and follows a certain format. So when you go and you run a commit, it can then go and link your code to see if you're following Drupal best practices and the commit message as well. As you push your changes, for example, to GitLab, that's when your CI jobs run, and then you can get your automated testing. And if you're set it up, you can have it automatically deployed to a dev environment. So what we do at work is we have feature environments, which is basically a hosted website for our branch, and then we check that the feature works there. Once we're happy with that, we just merge it into the dev branch, and then it goes to the dev site. So then we can test it there. And on Thursdays, we then go and run our releases with the site updates to go and push all those changes on there. Then we talked about debugging. So not using print statements, we can use xdebug and the quick debug. So here are some of the available services in Dropfort Build. These aren't all of them, but these are some of the main ones. You have MariaDB, which is going to be your database for your site. We also have a service for migrate. So, for example, if you're trying to migrate a site maybe from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9, you can fire up the migrate database, import your database into the migrate one, and then when you're using migrations, you can then use the migrate database as your source. Then we have Drupal, and another one is Mailhog. So in your local development environment, if you want to send emails or format emails, Mailhog will capture those emails in your local environment, so then you can go and view the email and confirm that's being sent. Another popular one that we like to use is Selenium. So we're talking about Selenium and Selenium Grid. It's basically a way for you to do browser testing, like actual UI testing, and we can demo that one in a bit. And then Apache Solr. So we use Apache Solr to help with searching for websites, and it can be useful because you can have a Solr instance running in your dev container, and then you can test search functionality. So Dropfort Build has a lot of environment variables. These are just three that I wanted to point out. So earlier I talked about doing site updates. You can have multiple sites open. So when you have multiple sites open, you can be using the same port, and then that can conflict. So you can specify which port you're using on each one. So if you want to have, say, 3 Drupal sites open at the same time, you can say, I want it running port 7,000, 8,000, 9,000, and you have your managed port as well, which is where you can find traffic, which will show you all your routes. So let's do a little demo. All right, so if I go to, I'll exit out of that. So here's the documentation, and we'll just cover over the commands, what they do, and then we can go and then explore actual Dropfort Build. So the first thing is that I'm actually on a provisioned computer, so I don't have Composer installed. So we use Docker images, which is in the documentation. So if I run alias Composer, you can see that I just made an alias for Composer and then run this Docker command with this specific version, so that way we can get PHP, Composer PHP and version, so that way we can get PHP 8.2. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is we're going to create a scaffold of a basic Drupal site. This isn't including Dropfort Build so far, so right now we're just scaffolding Drupal. Another thing I'd like to note is that I also don't have PHP extensions installed, so I may have to run some other commands, but we'll see. Yeah, all right. So here is simply just because I don't have this PHP extension installed, so I just have to add the ignore, which is right here. Okay, so let's demo, and then run that command again. Okay. So here we're going ahead and scaffolding. So we don't have Dropfort Build yet, but we have our web directory, which just has all the Drupal code in it. You have your composer file, and then you have your vendor, which is where composer goes and downloads all the packages. And inside of the composer file itself, we'll have install paths, and that's where it's going to copy the specific modules to where they're going to go. So for example, if you have like a contrib module or a custom module, stuff like that. So before we go ahead and actually require Dropfort Build, we'll just do some preparation to the composer file. So if we look at this first command here, it says prefer stable. So composer packages can have different stabilities, have like alpha, dev, stable, and this is basically saying that when it goes and looks for a package, we want to prefer the stable version, but if not, we'll accept dev as well. Since some packages we use may require dev. So we'll go ahead and do that as well. So right now we're just modifying the composer file. And here we're basically allowing Dropfort Build to actually scaffold files into our project, which is all just modifying the composer file that we can look at after. And then finally, before actually requiring Dropfort Build, we'll go ahead and not tell gitignore not to ignore our scaffolded files. Okay, so the next step we're going to do, now we've prepared our composer file, we can now go ahead and require Dropfort Build. Before I do that, I'm just going to copy that and this one right here. Okay, so composer require, and then we can just throw that in there. And then you can go ahead and require this package. And you'll notice that requires a devcon package because we won't need it on the production site. Alright, so now we're requiring Dropfort Build, and once we require Dropfort Build, that's when we should see the file scaffolded in.
They just released 11 this morning. It requires PHP 8.3.
Oh, that's actually fine. It's actually fine. Alright, fine. It'll be like that. Alright, what do we got now? Volume 1, 8.3, your PHP version. Okay, that's wrong. What is the command for the requiring the specific PHP file? Because what we can do to the file. Sorry. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll just require a specific version for these guys. Here. So we'll just do this. 6.0. What's that? And this point I just want whatever version. And there's 2 more packages. Nope. Actually, I should go just do that. Okay, here.
It's recorded.
Oh, do I?
Yeah, it runs like recorded.
Yes. No. Yes. All right, what now? Scaffold. Okay. So just running. All right. So you do ls, and we can see now we have a bunch of files scaffolded under our project. And now, before we go and get set up, we just need to set some environment variables. So, environment variables, we set them in the .env file, so we can name this demo and save this here. And then this is going to be used to name the actual Drupal container itself. So we can see once we rebuild this in the container, we'll say demo underscore Drupal. And it's important to make sure you change this, because if you don't change it and then you have multiple sites open, then they're going to be having the same container names. So if we open up the container folder, we can see this is where the actual container itself is. We use Docker Compose. We have a bunch of services defined inside of here. And this basically gets used by this dev container over here, which then goes and references it. So now what we can do is we'll make sure to set the environment variable for both. So we're going to demo, save that. And then if we go to the other one, just make sure, all right, so we should be able to now rebuild without cache. So now we can open it into a dev container. So as you can see, as it runs goes and builds the dev container, it's going to run your npm install and composer install. And then you should have some containers running. And you can see over here if we do. Not yet. So we'll just wait a moment for that. And while that's running, we can maybe take a look at the documentation a little bit. So this is the Dropfort Build documentation, covers the different items. So we just covered the getting start part. If you look down at some of the other sections, we can see over here like the committing coding standards that's being used. So when you go and run a commit, it's going to check that you actually follow that commit standard. All right. So now we're inside of our dev container. You can come over here, you can run Docker PS. You're going to see here all the different containers that we are running. We have demo maillog, we have MariaDB, Drupal, and Trafic. So you can come over here, and one of the first things we can look at is the npm file. So if we go to the package.json file, this is where we'll have all our npm scripts. These are being used in the CI pipeline, but we can also run them from our local container. Some of them, for example, are releases, running builds, running linters. Some that may be of interest that we can check out is, for example, test acceptance.js, which uses concept.js. And one of the tests in there uses Selenium, so then we can actually go and look at how to do a browser test, for example. So before we get started, we need to do a Drush install, Drush site install. So one of the tools that we use when working on Drupal sites is Drush, and provides a lot of different things you can use. A lot of useful things like generating scaffolding for a plugin, for example. So that way you can generate a plugin and know that you didn't name something wrong and try to spend all this time figuring out why is my plugin not working. Alright, so when you do a site install, there's different profiles you can use. What we often do is we'll do a site install as a minimal, so that way you have as little as possible in there, and then you can import your site into that. But to get something actually up and running and be able to see, I'll use a standard profile. So we go ahead and run our site install, and once that's finished, we should be able to actually go to the site itself. Some other things we can look at while it's running is we have our CI folder here, and it includes a profile.drupal.yaml file, which basically is just this massive file that includes all the CI templates and defines all the stages that is going to be used inside of your continuous integration. So you can see we have tasks, so you can manually run like getting a database from a prod environment. You can run copying a database from prod to development environment, and all that other stuff. I can't really demo this right now, but another thing this does is that it will copy your SSH keys from outside of your environment into your environment so that you can set up site aliases, which should be, they're not going to be set up, but inside of Drush, inside of the Drush folder, you could set up like site aliases, so that way you can do like drush at, then whatever your alias is, and then you can SSH in, or you can run commands against another site. Alright, so now run some Drush UI. So that's going to generate us a password reset for the admin user, and then we can go to the actual site itself. So now we have a Drupal site that we were able to get without doing too much configuration. One of the things that we can look at is if we go to another page, so if I duplicate this, go to Mailhog. I might have that name wrong. One sec. Okay, so if I come here, you can do that. And then run 80. We can look at Traffic, which has all our different HTTP things, and then we can see that's the routes for Mailhog. So it's going to be mailhog.dflocal.net. Alright, so there, mailhog.dflocal.net. So if I go back to the Drupal site, 1000, and I log out, for example, and then I go to the login page, go to reset password, and then I just type in the username, and I hit submit. We can come back to Mailhog, and we can see that we were able to receive the email here, so that way you can debug your email and see what it's doing from there. Another service, I don't remember if this service is running right now. No, it's not. So now we can get into how do we turn off a service or turn on a service. So a quick way to see what services are available to you is just by checking the dev container, and inside of Docker Compose, if we go to Outline, you can see we have all our services listed here. So MariaDB, Migrate, Drupal, Mailhog, PlantUML, Traffic, and so on. So if we want to turn one of these services on, what we can do is we can take the name, so for example, like Solar or Selenium, and we can add it to our environment variable. So what I'll do is I'll open up the editor and then go to the .env file, and then here we just have to list Selenium Solar, save it, and then rebuild the container. So now when we rebuild the container, we should have an instance of Apache Solar running and an instance of Selenium, and we can go and visit Selenium, and I can quickly just run a test to show it interacting. Another useful thing with Dropfort Build is you get automatic site updates. So on Thursdays, what we'll do is we'll have a CI job, basically create a merge request for us, create an issue, and we'll look at Composer and NPM and tell us which packages are out of date. Is it a security vulnerability? Is it a general update? And based off of that, we can do our updates just by pulling it down, checking to see that it works, confirming it works, and then deploying it to our production by doing a release. Okay, so now if we go here, for example, and we run .ps, we can see that we now have more containers. We have Selenium, which is our Selenium grid, and we have instances for different browsers, and we also have Solar. So if I come over here, and I believe I should just have to type Solar, and then we can see here's the Solar administration thing. I don't remember what the username and password is. I think it's just in the file. Yeah. Okay. So Solar/SolarBox. And then you can see we can log in and we can interact with Solar. And then we also have Selenium, which if I go back to Traffic, we can look at the different services. And I believe the route is just Selenium. Okay, so we come over here. Oops. And then we can see here's the Selenium. And then if we come over here, we can then go and run a test that uses the actual Selenium grid. So if we go into the testing folder, these are all our tests, code.set.js. We have an output folder, a screenshot folder, and this is basically being used for taking screenshots of the site, comparing them, and being able to store that somewhere. So if we look at tests, for example, we have some example tests inside of here. Visual regression is one of the examples. It's basically comparing, by default, it's comparing the Drupal.org site to your local Drupal container. And then we can go and run those containers. And then if I put something in like I.wait 5 seconds, and save that, we can then go and actually go run that container. So we may have to run npm install, but let's see. And while it's running, we can come over here, go look at sessions. Right now we won't see anything because it's running headless by default. But you can see there's a Selenium instance and you can log in there, and that's where you'll actually see the browser interacting. So we only have 10 minutes left, so I guess we'll do questions and finish the rest of the slides. So, all right. Any questions? questions?
Who maintains
Cold Front Labs.
Cold guys?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're
Yeah, because like this is like kind of we're just talking about who maintains Dropfort Build.
Okay, us.
Yeah, us. So yeah, because it meets like some of our specific needs, and it helps a lot having the same tooling for a lot of the different sites. Because then, if I need to switch to a different site and work on that site, then I can just go and work on that without having to relearn everything. Yep.
Does Dropfort have a place in sort of an enterprise deployment in Azure, for example? If you've got a government institution, they've got 20 websites deployed in Azure, you're managing everything in Azure. Does Dropfort have a place in that sort of infrastructure?
It can. So the CI pipeline is all written for GitLab, so GitLab CI. So we do actually have some clients who are running on Azure, and the CI pipelines run on GitLab in that Azure environment just as anything else. If you want to use the Azure pipelines, it's just a matter of either triggering the last phase, which is like, you've done your build, you package your stuff, you have a build artifact. Is it GitLab CI that delivers it to the server, or do you trigger a secondary workflow in DevOps, or Azure DevOps to run its pipelines? And that's a pretty common thing that it does, because we have integration with Pantheon and Acquia stuff. So we do a build, then the deploy job switches from just an rsync to like clone the control repo, copy it over, push up the control repo, and then things happen. And then the rest of our pipeline runs to do other things. So because you can mess with whatever template you want in there, it's flexible to work with whoever stuff is, while keeping most of our things as common as possible.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to talk.
Sure.
All right.
So this is running your whole container environment and everything as well. Do you run that on the developer workstation as well? I've got my laptop here and so on, so I run my own copy of that configuration, and then that then pushes up to the the servers.
You have Docker running locally with VS
Yeah,
Code.
but configured by this.
Yeah, so VS Code and all that stuff, it drops those templates in so that you can reopen a container. You do all your work, you commit your code to your GitLab instance, and then those CI pipelines start kicking in, because it's all of the templates, all the code become part of your code base, so the version along with it. So that way, if you ever need to reship an old version, that stuff has changed, it still has the old deployment configuration in there. And then if you need to make a change along with like the code base, it all lives within the source repo. So that way it can be customized or changed or tacked on, whatever. Like some people run it like all they run is the GitLab CI validation. That's it. They don't want anything else. It's just like go make sure the coding standards passed and then move on. Versus some people just run like the full gamut of like accessibility tests, CSS regression tests, the post Selenium, like I think we even have the broken link checker that can run after you've deployed a site to make sure you haven't busted anything. So there's all sorts of different templates you can drop in. It's fun.
With this, do you have any like integration with things like laptop or like checking your Git stuff?
But sorry, with which?
Laptop, are you familiar with that?
No idea.
Oh, laptop is it's a host manager for Git. So
Okay.
I'm just wondering if that's something that
Yeah, we use it's Husky actually. Husky is it's the one of the npm package that puts in our pre-commit hooks, post-commit hooks, all that stuff that does
so it's kind of like checking for standards.
Yep. Yeah, so it writes its own like specific Git hook files. Okay. So that way, if you have your own that you want to run on top of it, like they shouldn't conflict. But yeah, so Husky is the npm package we use to manage all that stuff. Yeah, we tried to split the build tools to leverage a lot of like node-based stuff. Mainly because we didn't want that tooling to ever have to conflict with your site's build. So we don't use a ton of PHP or composer-based things for the actual like build and packaging and shipping. That way, they're separate, right? You can run. We use the same code with Drupal 7 as we do with Drupal like 10 or 11. Well, I guess 10 because 11 just came out today. But yeah, so a lot of the, and there just seems to be a lot more stuff.
All right, that's it.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.